In today's lecture, we are going to discuss an article by James Rachels titled Active and Passive Euthanasia. One of the primary purposes of this lecture is to really dig deep into this question of whether or not there's a morally interesting or morally relevant distinction between what's sometimes described as killing versus letting someone die, letting nature run its course. This is a major part of Rachel's article, but there's some other elements that are involved with this article as well that we'll dig into. So let's go ahead and just get right to that. So Rachel's begins by telling us that the distinction, the traditional sort of distinction that we have in mind with regard to whether or not active euthanasia is ever morally permissible, regardless of what we say about passive euthanasia, that traditional distinction between these two forms of euthanasia, active versus passive, according to Rachel's, requires critical analysis. We really need to think seriously about what this distinction is supposed to mean. And Rachel tells us that the conventional doctrine, the doctrine that says there is a distinction, a morally relevant distinction between killing and letting die, this is sometimes called the difference thesis, that this doctrine, even though it might seem intuitive, the basic idea that, letting die might be permissible, right? We're just letting nature run its course, but killing someone is never permissible. That's essentially the conventional doctrine, according to Rachel's. Well, according to Rachel's, this conventional doctrine needs to be rejected. And to do that, to show that, we're going to have to give an analysis of what exactly this doctrine means. And so, in order to do that, let's go ahead and just state the thesis as clearly as we can. This is the difference thesis. It says there is a morally relevant or significant difference between killing and letting die. This is eventually going to be rejected by Rachel's, but there's a couple other elements that we'll need to discuss as well. So another way that we could consider what Rachel's is doing in this article is essentially just arguing that this particular thesis, the difference thesis, is false. It's a denial of this thesis. So in other words, he's arguing for the positive claim that it is not the case that there is a morally relevant distinction between killing and letting die. This is basically the overarching conclusion of Rachel's argument in this particular article. So just to kind of recap what we just said, the primary distinction or the basic distinction between active and passive euthanasia, according to Rachel's, generally it's thought to be crucial for medical ethics. The basic idea is that it is permissible, at least in some cases, to withhold treatment and to allow a patient to die. But it is never permissible to take any direct action designed to kill the patient. Rachel's thinks that this basic claim is false. There are some cases, maybe even quite a few cases, where active euthanasia not only is morally permissible, but perhaps it's even the morally right thing to do. Now, there are basically four different arguments that Rachel's makes. The first point that Rachel's argues for is that active euthanasia, in some cases, is actually more humane than passive euthanasia. The second argument that Rachel's makes is that the conventional doctrine actually leads to decisions concerning life and death on irrelevant grounds, morally irrelevant grounds. The third claim that Rachel's argues for is that this conventional doctrine rests on the distinction between killing and letting die, that itself is of no moral importance. And finally, the fourth claim that Rachel's argues for is that the most important arguments in favor of the conventional doctrine are invalid, so they don't work. So you might be skeptical as whether or not any one of these particular arguments works on its own, but Rachel's, the kind of the way that the paper unfolds is, well, we can think of the paper as saying that in conjunction, all four of these arguments present a very powerful reason to think that, at least in some cases, active euthanasia is morally permissible, that this distinction really is of no moral relevance, right? And so we're going to look at these four different arguments. We're going to primarily focus on the third one, and that's what we'll do in the next few videos.